Hello and welcome. I'm your host, General Griswold Gaius Grim, and this is a Fringe Encounter with one Richard Rohlin, who looks surprisingly like this. Welcome. Um, First question:
Yep.
Do you know what they call the top of a wizard's tower?
The top of a wizard's tower. No.
Me either, but you're in one now, and
Okay.
you're gonna get some savings throws, and I give them to you and everybody else.
Okay.
Uh, they're against mind control.
Okay.
For me, they're against yours. For you, they're against me, and for everybody else, they're against both of us. You get to
Okay.
choose survival, social, wisdom, or heart as the basis for your savings throw. Please choose.
Let's go with wisdom. I married a woman named Sophia, so wisdom has never let me down.
That was probably the wisdom that first struck you. Uh, 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 Survivalists have the number of transformation 11. Socialists 16 today. Lovers of wisdom such as yourself, Baker's Coven 13.
Oh, all right.
Heart folks, Nat 20. Those are my
Nice.
people. I'll be all right. And Indigo Kids with 2. This is gonna get to you. Welcome. So most of the people that are around my channel are gonna know who you are already. So by way of introduction, I would like to play a game.
Oh, okay.
Simple game. 3 questions you can never answer the same way twice.
Okay.
First question: who are you?
Who am I? I'm in Holy Baptism Seraphim. My given name is Richard, and I'm a dad. I'm a writer.
Don't answer too much, sir.
Okay.
Because the second question is, who are you?
Okay. I'm a poet. I write poetry. I love poetry. I like. I think in terms of poetry, and that's how I tell stories.
And the third question is, who are you?
I'm a sinner.
Leaning heavily into the religion for both the first and the third answer. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Anybody who wants to know anything about your religious history can go watch this video with Pastor Paul. You are a game maker.
Mm-hmm.
You and have recently successfully kickstarted something.
Yes, we have a game called Amboria Role Playing in the World Under Starlight. The Kickstarter just funded, pretty successfully, and that's what I'm currently engaged in. Is basically finishing up all the writing for the second book, which is the campaign book. Just had a little more. Sometimes transporting like handwritten notes to something that somebody else could actually read and use is turned out to be a little slower than I thought it was going to be, but it's going well. So,
well, this episode of this Fringe Encounter is called Narnia Narrative and Planes of Existence.
okay.
So I like to touch at least each of the topics I put in the title, so I feel as though I've delivered on an episode.
Yeah, fair enough.
What are the planes of existence with concerns as regards the Amboria RPG?
The planes of you mean like the cosmology?
That's what I think of when I think of planes of existence.
Okay. But... yeah. So the setting is called The World Under Starlight, Quaodran in Amborian. I'm a linguist, so I do a lot of conlanging for my invented worlds.
Comlanging?
Yes.
That sounds like
constructed.
Sounds like a word I would read as commingling.
Oh yeah, conlang just is short for constructed language. So obviously Tolkien's languages, or like Klingon from the Star Trek franchise or something like that. So
as opposed to like naturally evolved, and we've heard people talking them first.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So so The World Under Starlight is actually only properly the name for part of the cosmos. So there's the you could say, let's go from the bottom up. So at the very bottom, of reality is the abyss. which is beneath the Earth's mantle and is water, like the waters of chaos. Coming up
but
from
material place.
Yes, yeah, sure. Probably one of those places that's like sort of maybe in between. But yeah, like for purposes of it's a fantasy world, and in a fantasy world we can wear our insides on our outsides. So yeah, so you've got chaos beneath, and then the surface world, or really what's just the world of mortals, and that is the first part of the cosmos that is considered the world under starlight. The abyss is not the world under starlight because the starlight doesn't reach there, right? So you got the surface world, which is the first part of the world under starlight, and then you have lower heaven. Lower heaven is the abode of the sun and the moon, and it's also considered as part of the world under starlight because it's beneath the stars. And then after lower heaven, you have middle heaven, and middle heaven is divided into 4 different spheres or realms. And the way that they actually, they're basically hemispheres of stars, but so the sky has 4 poles. There's a North Pole, South Pole, East Pole, West Pole. And
Is it a flat Earth, this world under starlight?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. But maybe. Could be. I mean, I think all fantasy realms are like flat Earth to like some extent, right? But certainly Narnia is, just to hit one of the other topics for today. But so you've got these 4 poles, but the 4 poles are each hemisphere of the heavens is part of an interlocking sphere. But the way that you see it from below, which is the only way you see it, is like 4 petals of a flower, or like 4 gears of a clock. So the constellations of each hemisphere rotate around in an interlocking way such that one of them is always at the center point in the heaven, and the one that's at the center point, like directly above, you could say like high noon, right? The one that's at the acme of the heaven is always going to be that's the constellation that's currently ruling. So Amborians use a stellar calendar based on which constellation is currently ruling in middle heaven. And the hemispheres kind of alternate north, south, east, west, except that the southern hemisphere only has 1 major constellation in it because most of the southern stars were cast out of heaven. So
I like this.
Yeah. So that said, there's middle heaven, but then middle heaven has 4 divisions, right? So there's sort of 4 heavens, and then beyond the north heaven, which is the highest realm of middle heaven, so the one that's farthest away from the earth, closest to God, is deep heaven, right? Deep heaven, and that's the cosmology, essentially. And so the souls of the righteous go to dwell in kind of a paradisical meadow, kind of a Elysian fields kind of a place in lower heaven. And then everybody else goes down to wait for judgment at the world's foundation stone.
I really like how you did the interlocking spheres dancing. Is that how your magic works? Is it related to that?
Sort of. Some of them, yes. So basically, the magic there are. There's the ritual system of the Amborian religion, which has to do with the interaction between water and starlight, and also just kind of liturgical participation in the hymns, or in the myths and the stories of the Amborian people. Then there's also there's scholarly magic, which is practiced by people who are scholars who also have the second sight. So the scholars being like a sort of an almost priestly institution within Amborian society, and it's male only, and it's but they have let's say certain ways of seeing the connections between things that ultimately does go back to the movement of the stars primarily. Not quite in the same way as like modern astrology or something like that, but definitely in a way that is seeing connections that go beyond normal things, and also things like certain realms of knowledge or certain realms of learning which can only be accessed at certain times of the year depending on like the pattern of the stars. And then there are also the seers, and the seers have many different sources, but they all basically have to do with interacting with starlight in some way. the idea is that starlight is what communicates the will of heaven to the lower world, right? And it's what governs the fates of basically everything except for humans, with humans having free will, but everything else, is sort of governed by. So if you understand that, then you can kind of understand,
like the stars are the DM, but all the players.
Yeah. No, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah, and it's just that basically this what the seer magic is based around is the ability to, the more in its more benign forms, it's the ability to just like fate becomes less arbitrary because you can see the larger pattern in what's happening. And then in the more malicious or like more malign forms, it allows you to manipulate fate, but that always comes with a payback later. It's like you sort of, if you decide that you want to be ruled by randomness and chaos and use that to your advantage, it will come back around to bite you at some future point. So the way that particular class works, for instance, is or tradition. So we have ritual traditions. It's a D100 game, so there are no classes, but you build a character and then you decide.
Why does the D100 game mean there are no classes? That doesn't follow for me.
All D100 games are basically based on RuneQuest, like from back in the day, and so RuneQuest was a classless system, and so that's why.
All right, because like I don't know. I guess my D100 experience was Marvel superheroes. That chart on the back, but there wasn't any classes in that really.
This particular game is using the class system, which was based on OpenQuest, which is based on RuneQuest. So because of that, it's kind of a classless build, but basically you can obviously the traditional like fantasy gaming classes are they are what they are for a reason.
You can build your character into that with the options,
right?
But they're
so
not
so really no matter what you build, you'll end up building one of the traditional fantasy classes, just because again those archetypes are a thing for a reason. But so basically you build a character and then you decide if you want the character to be a ritualist or not, and if they are, then you choose the tradition they're ritualist in. So with that particular the Seers of the Deep, they have the ability to manipulate fate, but when they do so, then they have to give dice to the game master, and the game master can roll those dice later and basically subtract that from any roll he chooses. So it's like I'm choosing to manipulate fate now, but with the understanding that this could come back to bite me at some point in the future when it's going to be not so good. So
that's a mechanic I've never heard before. Like,
it's pretty fun,
even with the giving of the dice, even if you throw that out, because that was unique. But like just the notion that, all right, I'm using my thing, make it work in the story later, bro. I like that. So let me slide though a little bit. There's like one or two ways I want to take it. Let's go with, you seem less LARPy than a lot of the people that brand themselves as ortho. Around that I've seen on the internet anyway. Like there's internet atheists and now there's internet orthos, which is weird because I didn't even know that was a thing. And so you're making this, you have this faith that I would say is taken more seriously than a lot of other ones. And you decide to do this fantasy RPG, and you have to invent God and whatnot for it. How did it feel any at all like you're tight roping near sacrilegiousness when you're doing that? And has your view of your understanding of your faith, like how does that relate to the cosmology of the game?
So I don't feel like it's sacrilegious. If I did, I just wouldn't do it. But I do struggle to like sometimes explain it to people, like explaining to my priest, oh, so I'm doing this Kickstarter now, or something like that, right? It's a little weird to explain it to people because a lot of religious people can, especially of like a certain generation, have preconceived notions about these kinds of games and what you're doing.
There's a lot of psyops in the 80s.
All that stuff. All that stuff. But basically, I really, I mean, I think I talked about this on Pastor Paul's video, but been deeply influenced, especially by Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, that essay. And one of the things that he says in there is, the coming of the gospel has not abrogated the legends. It hasn't done away with
ladies and gentlemen.
abrogated. Yeah, it just hasn't done away with legends, but it's hallowed them, right? And so it's actually only in the context of the gospel that we can be like fully free as myth makers. So I believe that, and obviously the cosmology of the world under starlight is incredibly influenced by Christianity. Without also, like, the thing you want to avoid is, I think, the thing that would actually be sacrilegious is if I just aped Christianity, right? So I'm not making any attempt to. There are some like hints at the incarnation or something like that, but I'm not going to make an attempt to depict it. I think Tolkien, somebody asked him about that once. He said the incarnation of the word is something I would never dare to depict in fiction, and I think that's the right approach. So you have to think about these things like it's a mirror held up to reality, right? So it's not reality itself, but it's a mirror that we can hold up to reality that helps people see things, especially if we're looking down all the time, right? Sometimes the mirror is the only thing to show you the sky. And so that's kind of how I view it. And again, anybody who's like Orthodox or really familiar with medieval Christianity, who like reads the world under starlight or plays in the world, is going to feel at home. So obviously details will be different, but there shouldn't be anything, but they should I'd say they'd feel like they were at home. So yeah, for me, it's just, this is a natural part of being the person that God made me to be, which is a storyteller. And this is my favorite way to do it. I like telling stories with my friends. So
good. There's two places I want to take it from here, but first I want to go a little bit deeper in, like, your understanding of free will for us versus how you applied it in your game world.
Okay.
Are those mirrors, or did you stretch it, or those two things?
So, I mean, I believe that man has free will, which is this is the Orthodox position. That's what I believed before I was Orthodox as well. But
no, it sure feels like it. So.
Yeah. There's no like determinism or anything like that. However, I also believe, and this would be the case for the world under starlight as well, I also believe that we are influenced and affected by spiritual forces outside of ourselves, right? A basic idea in Orthodox spirituality is the idea that not all of your thoughts come from you, and actually not that's true for bad thoughts. It's also true for good thoughts, right? If I have a really good thought or like a really good insight into something, it's a little dangerous to actually take credit for that myself, because then I start thinking I'm wiser than I am. But to understand that, maybe my guardian angel gave me that thought. Maybe that came from, maybe that came from a saint. Maybe that came from, ultimately, right, it all comes from God. But the same thing with temptations. Sometimes when I'll be confessing that I'm struggling with a certain thought or a certain kind of temptation, my priest will say, do you think that thought is coming from you? And I'll think about it for a moment and say, no, it's not. This is just, it's a demonic attack. That's all it is. And like understanding that allows you to kind of go through life actually with a lot more peace, especially like when dark thoughts come up and things like this. Just understand, okay, this is,
you don't have to take ownership of
it. Yeah. Well, it's or just this isn't coming from me. Now, what I take ownership with is what I do with it, right? Because I can choose to act on that or let it ruin my day or define my life or whatever, or I can just kind of like laugh at it. I mean, Metropolitan Jonah is an Orthodox bishop here in the United States. He said talking about like the online ortho scene, right? That we, but especially like young men, just take ourselves way too seriously, and it's important to like sometimes just say, oh, that's just a thought, and kind of laugh at yourself too, for being the kind of person who would even entertain such a silly thing, and just kind of like laugh at it and then go about your day, but don't fixate on it. So anyway, this came up in some interesting ways in the Middle Ages, and my cosmology is really just, it's not it's not an ape of the Ptolemaic model of the universe. Obviously, my divisions of the heavens are different, and the way the stars work is a little bit different, and things like that. But
Did you say Talmudic?
no, Ptolemaic,
Oh.
the Ptolemaic model of the universe. So this is the ancient, what's sometimes called the geocentric model. So you've got Earth at the center, and then the various heavenly spheres all going all the way out to God on the outside. And this is the model of the universe that, for instance, is like the main conceit of Dante's Divine Comedy. So one of the big questions they have in the Middle Ages is, well, we believe that stars and planets are angels, and which is what I did in my own cosmology, right? We believe that stars and planets are angels. So then, like, why do people sin? Is it because there's something wrong with us in our nature? Like, are we totally depraved, as Calvinists would say? Or is it because there is, we're just being sort of mind controlled by these malign influences from the stars, right? And so in the Divine Comedy, for instance, when Dante poses this question, the answer he's given is actually it's neither. Man is not basically evil. Man is not totally depraved. But he is sick, right? And his sickness makes him susceptible to demonic influence, but not to the point that you're not culpable for the things that you do. So we're not just being mind controlled either. So and if you understand this, then it opens up room for things like moral luck, right?
Moral luck.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the idea.
That's how we wish the universe works, for sure, right? It's like a knockoff of karma almost.
No. Moral luck is more like the idea that some people are, because of your circumstances, let's say, it's just easier for you to act in certain ways. So, for instance, I came from a good family. I have parents who have like a really strong, stable marriage, right? And so that just made certain things easier for me, right? Which is not to say that, I haven't had my own struggles or whatever, but it just made certain things easier for me. Somebody who's from, like born into like a war zone in Eastern Europe or something like that, right? That person has a lot lower, a lot less, let's say, moral luck. And, so at least from an Orthodox perspective, you'd say, to whom much has been given, much will be required, right? Like the person who kind of like had it good, right? And so it's easier for you to be, a virtuous person or whatever, that person is also going to be judged more strictly, right? Versus, like the person who is born into a war zone in Eastern Europe, and they grow up under the most horrible abusive circumstances, and and they fall into like certain destructive patterns of life because it's the only way that they know how to survive or something like that. God's not going to judge a person the same way that he's going to judge me. And so just understanding, like, we have free will, but also like we are not ourselves totally free. Only the saints are totally free, right? Because the saints are able to forgive everyone, right? This is what St. Gregory of Nyssa says. This is what God's freedom consists in. He says the way that, ortho people like to talk a lot about theosis, right? Becoming like God. But actually, whenever St. Gregory of Nyssa talks about theosis, it's always in the context of forgiveness. He says that the way that we become the most like God is when we forgive everyone, including ourselves, for everything. Because that's when we become actually totally free, right? Or that's the freest we can become as human beings.
How is that different from treating reality as though it's a simulation?
I don't think I understand your question.
Well, like it's a whole lot easier for me to forgive you for the horrible things you've done to me if, like, I see this as like afterwards we're going to be meeting up, and it was like a stage play that you were just playing your role while we were here, because what happened.
Yeah, well, but so the reason that's the reason it's different is because if from that perspective, it's still more fatalist. It's still more fatalistic, right? You're sort of like taking this fatalistic view that, oh, well, you just couldn't help yourself. And moral luck isn't saying that. Moral luck isn't, that's the thing. It's like you're still responsible for your actions, but the level of culpability, let's say, right, is different depending on your circumstances, right? One way to say it would be something like God grades on a curve.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's
yeah.
I grew up in the Bible Belt, and there was a lot of people like very concerned about who was and who wasn't going to hell.
Yeah. I mean, it's still.
And after a while, I was like, I'm just going to trust the judge.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Yeah.
I can't worry about it. That's not my decision to make anyway.
Well, Dr. Timothy Batista, in his book The Ethics of Beauty, which is really, really good and more people should read it, but one of the things he talks about is that actually sort of the basis of Luther's Reformation is that Luther himself had in Greek we would call it a loismi, right? A temptation, a thought, but like a bad thought, which is I'm going to hell, like constantly over and over and over again. Like, Luther before he left the Roman Catholic Church, he was going to confession like 8 or 9 times a day, like just like constantly. Nowadays we'd probably diagnose him as like being obsessive compulsive or something like that. But and so Luther is like constantly racked by this loisme, this temptation to despair, which we'd actually in Orthodoxy would say is the worst sin, because it's the one that keeps you from repenting. And so in order to deal with that temptation, what he decides to say is actually, repent, not repent, doesn't really matter. We're all just, snow over a dung heap, etc. And so,
That's
and so,
that's an apt description of reality.
well, that's really how Luther saw it. I don't remember if he said that or if one of his disciples did, but in any case, right? So what he sees is, okay, well, I'm always totally depraved, but Christ covers me with his righteousness. So that's the snow over my dung heap, right? It's just sort of like a I don't want to say a shell game, but anyway. So this is kind of the idea. And so what's interesting then is that the way that most Protestants, and I don't want to say all because I don't want to mischaracterize anybody, but the way that most Protestants evangelize is by spreading that loisme to somebody else, like saying, "Hey, did you know that you might be going to hell?" Right? So you take this temptation of despair that one guy had, and now you pass it on to somebody else. Well, now they're really concerned and they're afraid because they might be going to hell. And
It's
I'm not
almost
saying,
like a contagious mind virus.
a little bit, yeah. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about the state of our soul, right? But the what the Desert Fathers say, Saint Anthony the Great, for instance, says that the righteous man applies all of Scripture to himself and none of it to anyone else, right? So you were supposed to be concerned about the state of your own soul, and there is obviously a very important place for evangelism and stuff, but we don't do evangelism by spreading fear. We do it by spreading beauty, right? And this is why when Orthodox people went to evangelize, like the Kiev Rus or whatever, what do? They go and they build a church, and they build something beautiful, and they start holding services. We start doing the divine liturgy in that town, and then people are brought in. People are
Curious.
They come
Made
in, they see
curious.
the beauty, they encounter Christ, yeah, and they become curious. So and so this is why, for people who are out there trying to spread orthodoxy online by, like, for instance, telling other people they're going to hell, right? They're still being Protestants by doing that. Like, that's still the Protestant, let me instill you with fear so that you'll convert, right? Which is really not how we should be doing things at all. So
yeah, I as whatever I am, I can get on board with that, because like that's what, like, different versions of the way Christians sell their planes of existence or cosmology is like there's an asshole of people going to end up in hell, and so then you have to reconcile, like, your God is the God that makes an asshole of people and sends them to hell. And but let me steer back from that for a minute. Back to planes of existence and cosmology. What's the cosmology you find yourself in, like, actually?
I'm not clarify your question a little bit, because, like,
Well,
I'm
like,
not
you've
totally
developed
sure
the
what you mean.
cosmology for a game. What's the one for reality?
Yeah. Heaven is above the earth.
And also, I you're known for your universal history and love of history. And how much of that curiosity was to discern the cosmology you find yourself in?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I still basically accept medieval Christian cosmology as true. And that's how I that's how I tend to operate. I tell the story sometimes. I was at a conference for classical educators, and there was this university astronomy professor there, right? And he was selling this tool for teaching astronomy, like for teaching naked eye astronomy. And it was just basically just a medieval astrolabe that he had designed, and then like laser cut like balsa wood or whatever to put together. And it was a really cool thing. And so it's got a little person in the middle, and then it's got these dials on the side, and you set the dials to the hemisphere that you're in and the time of year that it is, and it will move all of the major constellations and stars and planets and everything in the relative position to this person. So I was very interested because I was like, dude, you just recreated, medieval astronomy. And he said that, yeah, the reason that he started doing this is because now when students come, not just undergrads, but like grad students, they know how to use a radio telescope to locate an extrasolar object and x 2 3 4 5 whatever, right? But they don't know how to go outside and tell you where Orion's belt is, right? And so people like have just like, even in the field of astronomy, they've lost the ability to do like naked eye astronomy, which is based on the orientation of where are you in the cosmos right now. And so I use this as an example to talk about why the medieval cosmology is not totally irrelevant or stupid or something like this, but it's actually first of all, it still works perfectly fine if you're trying to figure out when is the next solar eclipse going to happen, or what's the weather going to be like tomorrow, or something like that. Now, if you're trying to send a probe to, I don't know, Jupiter, then that's different, right? You need the other stuff for that, but most of us are not trying to do that, right? And so when the other thing that I often point out is that actually the model of the solar system that we're told is, the legit scientific one, is also incorrect. That actually, because it shows, because it shows the sun is stationary and the planets moving around it, which is not the case. The sun is also moving around other things, and you can find some good models of this online now, where it actually shows the sun is sort of moving through space and everything is kind of spiraling around it, being pulled along in its orbit. It's really beautiful, but that model is,
I don't think it's like that, man. Like even with their models, like there's the heliosphere.
Yeah.
And it seems as though there's like within the heliosphere, it's kind of like the way a cell works. But
yeah. Well, I mean, but the thing is, like, all of these models are incorrect on some level, right? There's always like some other angle that you could look at things at, or some other level of perception you could use, or something like that, and you'd be like, oh no, those stupid people in 2023, they thought they knew what the solar system was like, actually, right? So with that understanding, like understanding these different models are, they're all trying to save the appearances, they're all trying to explain the data that they have, that you can basically still use the medieval model and go through your life and be a happy person. And what's useful about it, right, is that it shows a world that's held together by love, right? And it shows a world in which man is set not at the center of the cosmos, really, but at the bottom of the cosmos, right? That you're at the bottom of this stair looking up, and there's this beautiful majesty going all the way up to God, but then God comes down to us, right? And so I mean, that's the world that I live in. A lot of it's funny you said I don't seem LARPy. I don't totally know what you mean by that. I mean, we just try to live like these things are true, and we have 5 kids, and we spend most of our time and our energy just trying to raise them well, and love them well, and take care of the people that God has put in our lives. And yeah, that's it.
Well, if we get to narrative, that'll be important. But first, where does Narnia exist?
Where does Narnia exist? Probably out in my backyard right now. I think the kids are playing Narnia today. So, but yeah, I mean,
like in terms of cosmology, it's this thought form, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy.
It exists in the minds and hearts of everyone that it's touched, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, yes, or in the. I keep coming up with answers, but they all sound too crazy. So,
This is going to be released.
I got to be careful about what I say, but yeah, I mean, Narnia is a thing that you can participate in through reading the stories, but also, through play. My children are big Narnia fans, so they often play Narnia. I've always wanted to run a game in Narnia. Actually, never done it. I did play a Narnia Mush, which is or Muck rather, which is online. It was an online game, but I've always wanted to run I think you could take BRP or something like that and make a pretty cool Narnia game. It would have to be something with size as a factor, because it's so you have all the different animals and such. But
in the Paul thing, you said you've read that book probably every year, or the series probably every year. So I've read it once when I was very little, and I've seen the first and second movies. Tell me about Narnia.
So the big debate that people always want to have is what order to read the book in, and it's very simple. You should read it in published order. Anybody who says otherwise is a heretic. Read them in published order, and the reason that you want to read them in published order is because Narnia unfolds as you read it. So The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the very first book, and the book sort of relies on the narrative tension of the children, and therefore the reader doesn't yet know who Aslan is, right? So if you read The Magician's Nephew before that, it sort of
spoiler alerts it.
Yeah, it just kind of cuts the legs out from underneath you a little bit. But if you start with the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the main idea of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is that all myths that we have in our world are true in some other world, but maybe not in the way that we think they are. So a really cool example of this, I'm actually glad you asked me this question, because I don't get to talk about this particular thing very often. But so a really key scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which will actually tell you how Lewis is doing his world building, which a lot of people, including Tolkien, criticize him for being sloppy, or he's just throwing stuff in and he doesn't care. But actually what he's doing is very careful, because Lucy goes to the house of Mr. Tumnus the Faun. Well, what are fauns known for in classical mythology? They're known for rape, not necessarily sexual in nature, but back when rape meant basically kidnapping, right? So they're known for kidnapping young women and carrying them off. Well, what is Mr. Tumnus's? Mr. Tumnus as a faun, he's a good creature. All fawns are always good, friendly creatures, except that Mr. Tumnus has fallen under the dominion of the White Witch. And what does she want him to do? To kidnap and carry off any little girls that he might meet and take them to her, right? So you have this. We have this legend in our world, but through the Gossamer film Between the Worlds, when you get to Narnia, that story still exists, but not in quite the way that you thought it was going to exist. But there's a really beautiful moment of insight that a lot of people just gloss over because they think it's just Lewis being cute or something. But that is the books in Mr. Tumnus's bookshelves, which are things like monks. What is it? Monks something and gamekeepers, or is man a myth? Well, obviously, if you live in a land of talking beasts, what's a gamekeeper? That's a boogeyman, right? That's the way that we would think about an ogre or a troll or something like that, right? What's a monk? Well, monks in let's say in Christian mythology, right? Monks have these close relationships with animals, things like this. So what's a monk? It's some kind of a benign, spirit, some kind of a friendly kind of a monster, right? So for the animals, right, these are their myths and legends are about monks and gamekeepers, right? There is the life of Silenus, which is Silenus, is this character from Greek mythology who's wild and has to do, is connected with Bacchus and wine and revelry and all this different stuff. But here's the life of Silenus, which is a kind of inversion of the Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, which is one of the probably the most famous biography ever written in the English language. And well, anyway, it was the kind of thing that if you lived when Lewis lived, you could not consider yourself an educated person unless you had read it, right? But it's a very long, multi-volume biography of this person that now Samuel Johnson, who in modern terms is quite obscure, but he's one of the most important people in the world back then. So here's this here's this long biography of him, but the biography was, is fairly dry in certain places, but also like really beautiful in other places. But the point is that here's this life of Silenus that's like Boswell's life of Samuel Johnson, which is, here's a biographical work of a very important person who is definitely real, right? So like something that's a myth in our world about this, kind of, crazy figure dealing like associated with like debauchery and drunken revelry and all this stuff. In Narnia, that's like a very respected person who has a very important biography written about him, right? So that if you look at the books on the bookshelves in Mr. Tumnus's house, it gives you kind of this insight into what Lewis is doing. So that's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which obviously, has leans very heavily into Aslan as the Christ figure, right? Stepping in, taking the place.
Seems like that bookshelf is a mirror. Like it's a point where he lets you see that it's a mirror.
Exactly. So, so then obviously you've got the same kind of mirror applied to things like the Passion and the Crucifixion, and the sort of like the Christus Victor model of salvation, which is that Aslan isn't really he's not taking Edmund's punishment, but rather he's paying the ransom owed to death and owed to evil, but then also in the process, death gets more than she bargained for, right? So basically you get this mirror sort of held up to our world, up to how mythology works, and also the through line of certain things are always true and they're true everywhere, right? Which I would say is kind of a like that's something I've always accepted tacitly as being true when I do world building or storytelling, is that God is the God of Fantasyland as well, right? Now, it doesn't mean I want to make an ape of Christianity or something like that, but that certain things are always true, right? And so you have, but then so that's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and by itself, it's just kind of like, here's Lewis saying some things that he's been trying to say about myth. When you move on to Prince Caspian is the first book in the series where Narnia really becomes its own world. And what I mean by this is that when you move on to Prince Caspian, you start getting you get a sense of depth and history and time that isn't there in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You get a sense of depth, history, and time, the sense that there's actually like a register, like a different register that people speak in Narnia that's different from the way that people speak in our own world. And all of
what do you
these
mean by register in that sense?
So there's this moment in Prince Caspian when Peter is composing a challenge letter to King Miraz of the Telmarines. And so he stops for a moment and he's like, all right, hold on, I have to think about how you're supposed to talk as a king of Narnia. So like he goes from being like this, 13, 14, 15, however old he is, probably 16 at that time. But anyway, he goes from being this kid to being, going back to being the High King Peter again. But in order to do that, he has to think about, okay, this world has its own rules. It has its own register, like in other words, like its own language and all these different things. And what you can see happening throughout Prince Caspian, it's not just there, but for instance, in the long list, early on in the chapter, when it's in like the second or third chapter of the book, when you're getting a summary of Caspian's education with Master Cornelius, the things that if you just look at the list of books that he's required to read, that actually does a whole lot of the world building. It tells you again, okay, that there's actually this whole sort of like scholastic, medieval scholasticism is kind of a thing in Narnia. But also there are a lot of tropes that really rely very heavily on Malory in Prince Caspian. And so Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, right, which is like the great English Arthurian retelling. So Prince Caspian relies a lot of that and just basically uses Malory as an text to do the world building for Narnia. So that's the book where Narnia really comes into its own as its own world. And then you go on. I'll just say this about the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is really neat, because in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, at one point they're given this map. There's this magical map that basically fills in all of the places they've already been, and as they go to new places, the map sort of updates in real time.
Yeah, we get those in video games all the time.
Yes, but so they're sailing. What are they doing? They're sailing east. Narnia is a flat world, right? So they're sailing east, and on the map, what's happening? Well, the ship is sailing towards the edge of the map. Well, when you get to the very edge of a medieval manuscript, what do you encounter? Well, you encounter border decorations, kind of like these that are on my wall. But you encounter like a border decoration or fringe, and usually it's lilies. Well, what do they meet when they get to the very end of the world in the Voyage of the Non-Treader? There's a border of lilies around the world, right? And they actually have to sail through that, and then they sail off the map. They sail out of Narnia, right? Out of the world. So the Voyage of the Non-Treader is the most medieval of the books of all the books in the series, and for that reason, it's probably the most difficult to adapt well to film. I mean, the BBC interpretation is pretty good because they just stayed with the book. But if you try to make it into, like, for instance, the film that came out back in the 2000s was atrocious, just the worst thing that you could possibly imagine, because it's not a traditional. Well, it is a traditional story, but it's not a traditional like fantasy narrative, right? There's not a quest except to find the end of the world. There's not a big bad guy that has to be defeated. There's not like some overarching evil, like none of that. It's just these sort of like episodes, and each episode is kind of its own medieval passion play that's sort of dealing with something different for each one of the crew members as you go. But
Toward
it's
the end of the world.
yeah, but it exists. It uses the same kind of narrative conceits as like Wonder Tales, the Voyage of Saint Brendan, Aristotle's, Wonders of the East, or something like that, like all these different medieval texts that Lewis was very familiar with. So it's the most medieval, and because of that, it's probably my favorite in the series. But my favorite Narnia book is always just whichever one I'm reading. So, and they're all great. I mean, I think the Silver Chair narratively is probably the strongest of the books, and certainly probably the one that had the biggest influence on my own imagination. A lot of the cosmology of the world under starlight, a lot of the characters in the games that I tend to run come from the Silver Chair. Probably the one that has like, a bunch of rent-free space in my imagination.
Wow.
So yeah, anyway, that's my pitch for Narnia. It's really, there's a lot more going on than maybe, people realize. And it's fine because like any good story, you can just enjoy it as this is a pretty fun children's series. Or if you are a medieval appreciator, as I am, there's like a lot more going on underneath the surface.
Well, that part where you were talking about the Prince Caspian fella and the register,
Mm-hmm.
that it's paralleling with playing an RPG, like
Yeah,
the different, like he's learning how to get in character.
yeah, I think so. I think that's part of like why the books resonate so easily, is because it sort of like, yeah, like if you played a game, if you've ever loved a fantasy world enough that you wished you could be there, like that's why like that sort of like magic portal fantasy, that's why that kind of story works, because like these are the kids who they actually get to go to Fantasyland, right?
Let me I don't know, see if I can spin it into a narrative. So I hit that thing. I remember struggling with the question, why save Narnia? And it maps to why save Jumpgate for me, which is essentially the Narnia I crawled into for 15 real life years. And it's like, so there's these kids that abandon their lives to go play in this closet.
Okay.
And why come back from Narnia? Why, how are you not wasting your life while you're there?
Yeah.
And these things, can you give me a take on that?
Good fantasy fiction doesn't make you throw down your weapons and retreat from the world. Bad fantasy fiction can like suck you in a way that's addictive. Now, obviously, different people have different personalities, and so some people, like even good fantasy fiction, would just like, totally take them out of the world in a bad way, maybe. But for most people, that's not the case. So,
how's it resolved in Narnia? Like,
yeah, so
you're just some yahoo at a mansion over here with some rich guys, but you can go be a high and mighty king in this other place.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting thing. It's one of the things that Lewis is maybe more attentive to than almost anybody else, is that everybody eventually hits a limit where they can't come back to Narnia anymore. So first of all, in every story, you have to go home at the end. The only story that's not true for is The Horse and His Boy, because it's not. Although the Pevensies appear in it, the main characters are native to Narnia, right? So that's just like a quest they're trying to get from Calormen to Narnia. But for all 6 other books, right? You enter Narnia, but then you have to go home at the end. And you have to go home at the end, and with each of the Pevensies, they are told after they've had a certain number of forays that you hit a point where you're too old to come back here again, right? You're too old to come back here again. And when Lucy is told this, who's like, really the main character for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and The Voyage to the Dawn Treader. When Lucy is told this at the end of The Voyage to the Dawn Treader, she's heartbroken. But Aslan says, don't worry about it. You're going to meet me in your world. And Edmund says, are you saying that you exist in our world as well? He said, yes, but I have another name there, and you have to learn it. And that's actually the reason you were brought into Narnia to begin with, right? So like the whole purpose of the Pevensies coming to Narnia wasn't even to save Narnia. It was so that they would learn to look for Aslan in their own world. And the way that this all comes together beautifully is at the end of the last battle, when Narnia ends up being true. The best version of our world ends up being true, and it's all part of Aslan's country. But that happens beyond the veil. That happens after the Pevensies die in a train wreck, right? So yeah, that's the so Lewis was like, I think, very attentive to this, and at the end of the day, man, like if the version of Christianity you're in is not compelling enough, it's not as compelling as a fantasy world, then like, you may need to find a new church. I don't know what to say. Like actual Christianity, the actual faith that we've been given is so beautiful, and it's so mysterious. It's full of so many weird, unexplainable things. There's so many, crazy, experiences you can have with, myrrh streaming icons and the wonder working bones of the saints and like all this stuff. Like, and you can just go, it's, it's free. You can just go and kiss the bones, or, if you don't have wonder, right? If it's like, if you're getting more out of, whatever, online games you're into or fantasy worlds that you're into or whatever, but there's no wonder like in actual religion for you anymore, then buddy, you're in the wrong place.
Well, a lot of us start with no wonder in religion as a baseline.
You're right. Oh. But it shouldn't be that way, because like even the Gospels themselves, right? Just like the Gospels are so bizarre that it would take somebody explaining the wonder in them away from a very young age, from a very early age, which I know happened to most of us. But like, you have to explain the stuff away, because if you don't, then like Jesus will just say and do things, and it's like, I don't even know what this guy's going to do next, right? Like it's like he's so strange and mysterious. Like the Gospels themselves are just really like mysterious. Even you could say bizarre. I don't mean that in an impious way, but like really, really, really bizarre in certain ways. So I if you can like, and this is what Lewis always said he was trying to do with Narnia, is to sneak past what he called the watchful dragons, which he said are like the Sunday school associations. So basically, like, you got all of this stuff explained to you a certain way when you were young, and it sucked all of the joy and the wonder and the mysteriousness out of it. So what he was always trying to do was to tell a story that would kind of sneak past those watchful dragons, and then the next time you go to like, Holy Week service, you've got that frame of reference of Aslan and Susan and Lucy and what they go through as they stay close to him. Well, who is it that stays close to Christ in the Passion, during the Passion? It's not his disciples, because they all ran. There's just John the Beloved, or John the Evangelist, and his mother, and the women who were with her, right? It was the women who stuck around. They're the ones who were faithful. They're the ones who like walked all the way with him, all the way up to the foot of the cross. and they didn't care that they would be killed or whatever. But that's like what happens in the story. It's Susan and Lucy, right? If you read that story and you see at what Aslan goes through the eyes of Susan and Lucy, it equips you better to understand like what's the Mother of God going through during the Passion, which actually for Orthodox Holy Week services, most of them are from her perspective, right? So you're being asked actually imaginatively, right, as an act of the imagination, to enter into these beautiful service texts where, you know, she's singing her lament at the tomb, right? And you're supposed to like there with her because we love Christ, because we love her, because we love all of these people. We're going to stay with them and we're going to be with them in this embodied way. But Narnia is the kind of thing that can equip you to do that. So, yeah.
I like that angle. So this is intensely personal subject, but what I'm asking for is a recounting of your physiological experience.
Okay.
You said that when you went to the Orthodox Church and you had your ass up in the air, something happened. Like, I don't need to know what was going on in your heart or your mind or your spirit in that, but like, what was the physiologic felt the something?
Honestly, I couldn't say. Honestly, I couldn't say. I mean, it was a very beautiful kind of a moment, and I don't want to. Because of that, I'm really reluctant to talk about it. But yeah, like physiologically or something like that, I couldn't say.
Well, it's like I'm trying to imagine what would be that moving, right, for me, and
yeah,
it's like a physiological, like for me, it's the way crying works. I'm imagining it like that, like the way the emotion is just like more than the physical body can deal with at a time, but probably not. I mean if it was like that, it would be a beautiful.
So that's the thing, is that, and I've certainly experienced things like that sometimes in the services, but actually I think if you looked at me at that particular moment, you wouldn't have noticed anything, right? Because I wasn't crying, and it wasn't really emotional. I almost never get emotional in the services. I say almost never because sometimes I have. Sometimes I especially like so sometimes I serve as a reader or as like a chanter at our church, and sometimes I'll lose my place because I get so caught up in like the hymn that I'm supposed to be chanting right now or something. It's just like, oh, this is amazing. Ooh, this is amazing. And then I'll kind of lose my spot. But even that, like, you could say that in Orthodox spirituality, I wouldn't say like you're outright discouraged, but like you're not really expected to be looking for like some big emotional feeling. And actually, if you are serving, like if you're responsible for, you're a priest or a deacon or an altar server or something like that, you're not supposed to do it emotionally, and you're not supposed to do it on the Holy Mountain, on Mount Athos. Actually, piety is like a negative word, right? You're not supposed to do things piously, right? You should just do things simply. You should be straightforward. You shouldn't do it in a way that's going to call attention to yourself. And you shouldn't do it in a way where you're trying to make yourself feel something, right? And I think that this is a big problem with, for me, like my emotional cup is only so deep. So like if I try to constantly make myself feel things about things, then I get burned out. And it's really actually really freeing to go to services and know that because we can connect with God in our spirit, in our nous, or whatever you want to call it, like your very inner person. But because you can do that, I don't need to feel things. And actually, if it's not helpful, I don't even need to think things. Now, sometimes thoughts will come. Sometimes feelings will come and things like that. And some of those are good and some of those are bad. But like, you don't need them, right, to worship God. You can just be there with him. I'm been married for almost 14 years now. And I love my wife. She loves me. We like being with each other. We don't always need to talk. Like sometimes this is enough just to be like, hey, you want to hang out, and I'll, you can paint some minis and I'll read my book and we'll just, whatever. I got this here. I'll show you my little elf champion in progress right now.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, but anyway, so just being together, and that's the way it can be with God. Words are good and useful and necessary for worship and prayer and things like that, but also they're not, right? Also, like, you could just go stand in front of the icons for a little bit if you wanted to.
All right, physiologically aside, then what would you say was the shift that happened in you from before and after? I got the impression from that talk it was like a sense of belonging and or hominess.
I'll give you like two distinct impressions. One is that this is the shape of everything. This is the shape of everything. This is the way the cosmos really is. Like, at the end of the day, like, what cosmology do I live in? It's the liturgy, right? That's the shape of everything. That's the shape of, like, the ascent of the heart towards virtue, ultimately towards Christ. That's the shape of the whole history of humanity and salvation. That's the shape of just the very basic movements that we do throughout our day. All of that stuff is in the liturgy. It's the meta pattern. It's the pattern about patterns. And actually, the big secret about what we're doing with universal history is actually just trying to get people to think of history and storytelling through the liturgy. We can't like say that overtly, or
it won't work.
Or won't work. But that's really that's how that's how we approach things. The other distinct sense that I had in that moment was, this is the kingdom. There is a king. This is the right way to be before the king, right? So I wouldn't say that's the experience itself, but those are like the distinct like impressions that I had after that moment, right? And
it was like the shift in the cosmology from before and after.
Yeah, and so for me, that was the moment where like everything came into alignment, you could say. And but those are like the first initial impressions, and still the ones that are probably with me the most. Yeah.
Well, let's move away from the deeply, intensely personal topics then. Let's bring up the apparently my mouse battery is going out now. Uh-oh. There we go. Let's bring this up. We're gonna get into narrative. How much more time? Do you have enough time for me to go get coffee?
I've got a few more minutes. Yeah, go and get some coffee.
I'll be right back. That wasn't intentional, but we're back.
Yeah, that couldn't have been timed better. Coffee sounded like such a good idea. I got some too.
Let me spin you a narrative.
Okay.
I once upon a time went into video games of a various sort. One is my Narnia, one, and a lot of them are just every a gamer games. Eventually, I happened upon a YouTube video during my morning that convinced me that things were bad enough. In reality, I can't not do nothing. And then so I had a phase as an internet truther.
Okay.
That collapsed about the same time I made the connection that between the crowd there and people who consume special victims unit marathons on TV.
Okay. Yeah.
Like at the end, I'm just watching over and over these shows about people getting abused. Wait a minute, what's that make me kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I ended up in what we're calling this little corner
Yeah.
of the internet, this flotilla of channels, as I like.
Oh, nice.
And, you have your own notoriety built in because of your universal history project. We sort of see you as,
yeah,
sort
and
of
I don't
see you as the
actually
guy
really.
who's going to end up riding the jet ski behind Pajot the way he did with the other guy.
It's funny because I don't really do my own channel. I do have a channel, and I mostly just do Amboria content there right now. But like, I don't think of myself as a YouTuber. I just mostly go into other people's channels. So
Yeah, it's you're a recurring character in the scene, though. It's like, for me, it plays out a lot like the way people watch an ensemble series,
mm-hmm.
except it's like fractaling up, so it's a lot broader of a thing, but it's mapping out similarly, and like crossovers are the lifeblood that holds it together, and like characters that make the circuit on the channels. But the result of those two parts of my path have led me into it started with what I should try and talk people into doing was like, have you Harry Pottered?
Have I Harry Pottered?
Yeah, did you make your way through that series at all?
No, I tried it. I tried starting it a couple of times and was never able to get into it as a young person, and then I've just never come back to it.
So essentially, the gist of the story is evil is back.
Yeah.
And they won't talk about him, and they suppress it like it doesn't exist. And as a result, the entire school for the children's gets corrupted. And at some point, there's this place called there's this magical, I don't know, magical places are so much weirder than magical items. But there's this magical place called the Room of Requirement. And like, you can't find it until you need it. But when they find it, it's because they need it, and what they need it for is because their school has been so corrupted, they have to learn defense against the dark arts. And metaphorically, this is mapping to me to what we're doing here in this little corner.
Mm-hmm.
Because the world around us is following the same arc and trajectory,
for sure,
as far as I can tell. And I got very excited when you discussed the curriculum development that you've done before.
Okay.
Because that is the weak sauce I have in that whole notion for around here. And what do you got for me about educating people and curriculum development?
Yeah. So we homeschool 5 kids, which is a heck of a full-time job. I'm certainly not somebody who believes everybody should homeschool because it's a hard thing. Not everyone is circumstances and everything can do it. But if you can do it, it's a huge privilege. So we do something called Charlotte Mason Education.
Charlotte Mason, you said?
Yeah, Charlotte Mason. She was a 19th century a British educator, and she kind of came up with a method of education that emphasizes first and foremost the personhood of the child. So they're not an object to be molded into whatever you want to mold them into, and they're not just like, let me crack your brain open and pour some facts in, which is how many of us were educated. And unfortunately, this is how Christianity has tended to be taught in the West.
What is that? What's that look like when one does that? How do you whatever a personhood?
Yeah, so we start with education starts with fairy tales and myths. And for the first few years of a child's life, they are, actually just playing. But, when they start school, they begin school with fairy tales and myths. Because these are the things that sort of train the eyes of the heart to see the things that you need to see. Right. And you learn certain things from fairy tales that you don't really have any other way of learning in the modern world.
You got a clean example of that?
So last night we were sitting around. My brain was kind of fragged out from writing and working all day. So we decided to sit around, and I was working on some miniatures, and my wife read Grimm's fairy tales to the family for about 2 hours. And the kids just sat and listened. But sometimes the fairy tales are just like very simple. And so this is why you should be honest. This is why you should confess your sins, right? But there are deeper lessons in the fairy tales that have to do with actually revealing patterns of reality, right? But the thing is that you can't be trained to notice these patterns by simply being told there is a pattern. Even Jonathan, even Peugeot, when he's like doing videos on patterns or symbolism or things like that, he's not telling everything he sees. He's not telling everything that's there, because if you tell somebody, then they won't be able to see it, right? You have to develop, let's say, like the sensory organ yourself. So
I'm reminded of those things from the 90s that were on the wall, and you had to like let your eyes relax.
Yeah.
See it.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So I mean, for instance, learning that, like the trope of like the wicked stepmother or like the cannibalistic mother in stories like this, right? Well, what's that about? Why does it come up so often, right? Is it just because a lot of people were eating their babies back in the day? Well, no, not exactly.
Well, they were hungrier, but
yeah,
that's not it.
Yeah, not usually that, but it's really, let's say, just as an example, like it's teaching you there's actually certain ways that love can go sour, right? There's certain ways that love can go sour and become consuming and become worse than hatred. And most of us have to wait till we're way older to sort of figure that out. But if we'd been taught by fairy tales to kind of be on the lookout for these things, right? There probably like a lot of bad experiences and bad relationships and things like that we'd be able to be keep our keep out of. But and ultimately, fairy tales are the things that teach us how to read the scriptures. They're the things that teach us how to read hagiography. They're the things that teach us how to be humans. But you can't do this by reading a fairy tale and then saying, this is where respecting the personhood comes in, right? You can't do this by reading the fairy tale and then saying, okay, kids, let me now that we've read this story, let me tell you what the moral of the story is, right? That's objectifying them. The way that I heard somebody say it once, and I really held on to this, is that there is a holy place in your child, right, in their heart, where only God can enter. And if you try to enter that place for them, that's sort of like that's exactly what Satan is doing, right, with Adam and Eve, right? He's trying to get them to direct their worship towards him, so eat his food, be in communion with him, rather than direct their worship towards God. And so this is just, you can't enter there without committing like a really grave sacrilege. So you expose the children to these kinds of stories that have these fundamental patterns in them, but then you allow them to start to sense and notice things and see commonalities between things, recognize relationships between things on their own, and you kind of go from there. So that's
there. I think we've essentially gotten the crew around here. Like, for the purposes of the Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum I'm working on, we'll say that the emphasis on the personhood is, rather than teaching a children something, it's awakening the adults to the fact that you're not just audience.
Yeah.
Like the audience spell is pretty powerfully in effect here. So what's the next phase of this personhood focused?
So we start with that, and then as we start to introduce, let's say, more like school books, we don't do textbooks. We use what are called living books. So a living book is a book that was either written by somebody who saw the events, like a firsthand narrative, or by somebody with a really lively interest in them, right? So we wouldn't use a history textbook. But like, for instance, if we want to teach our children, usually we start with, one in like the first term or whatever, one of the books that we do with them is a book called Our Island Story, which is like a sort of like a mythological retelling. It goes all the way back to, Albion and the giants and everything, all the way up to like the time of Queen Victoria, something like that. But it's like a mythological retelling of the history of the British Isles. So that's we actually would begin with that as a history book, right? Because it sort of like bridges between like fairy tales and recorded history and things like that. So, but then we use other living books. We use, again, a lot of primary accounts. There's a huge emphasis in this particular method of education on Plutarch's Lives of the Greeks and Romans. So even at a very young age, we start reading Plutarch to them. Because basically it's like, here's the life of a great Greek, here's the life of a great Roman, here are their virtues, here's the way that they failed, here's the ways they succeeded, all that stuff, right? So and
virtue architecture might be the next part.
Yes, but again, sort of like allowing the child to kind of build that for themselves, but by setting good examples in front of them. Setting the analogy that Miss Mason always liked to use was this idea of spreading the banquet, right? So you spread the banquet for the child. Here's all the beautiful things. Here's all the best things. Here's all the best stories, right? Instead of just saying, I mean, like, I don't know if you've read any contemporary textbooks recently, but they are ugly and unimaginative and dull, and the sort of things that are intended to kill children's capacity for imagination so that they'll be better factory workers, right? That's what modern education is for. So instead of that, we spread the feast, we spread the banquet for the children, and throughout all of this, they're being shaped by the liturgy, and they're being shaped by the family, the family life, and having real embodied experiences in the world through sports, which are important, and through other things, but then ultimately developing their own taste, right? Learning to pick and choose the evil or choose the good. Don't choose the evil. Choose the good and despise the evil, kind of a thing. So we, but it's kind of being built naturally as we kind of spread this feast before them of living books. There's also a big emphasis on Shakespeare. The children start doing Shakespeare's plays, like reading them, discussing them, talking about them when they're like 5 or 6 years old. And so, by the time that they're first in like summary form, and then later, we'll take them to plays, we'll read the plays together, we'll watch the film versions of the plays and things like that, because Shakespeare had a really unique capacity as a storyteller. Actually, I'll just make a prediction right now. I'm not a prophet, but here you go. Since I rolled so well on my wisdom save earlier, Shakespeare is going to be that'll be the next big thing for this little corner. Like, everyone's doing the Lewis's Cosmic Trilogy right now, which is awesome, and I'm very excited about that. But man, y'all are sleeping on Shakespeare. There's so many of Shakespeare's stories which have just really fundamental patterns of humanity and virtue and what it means to be a person, and also like, how do we navigate the collapse of society around us, and how do we navigate tragedy, and how do we navigate comedy, and like all these things. Like, that stuff is all in Shakespeare, and I think that I'm excited for when people inevitably start getting into it, because I think that's going to be.
You heard it here, folks. This little corner is damn near caught up to the Richard 6-year-olds. Oh, that's so painful. This is a painful reflection.
So yeah, and then the other thing that I'll mention is a really big part of this education is something called narration, which is kind of what I've been doing with you today. So whenever it starts out when children are very young, you just read a portion. So before they even learn to read, you read a portion of a story, or you read like a short, like a fairy tale or something, and then you say, "Now tell it back to me in your own words." It's not a test. There's no grade. And if they get something wrong, you don't correct them. You just say, tell it back to me in your own words, and then they narrate it back to you. As children get older, the narrations become longer and they start to become written, and this is how you learn to write. But initially, you're just telling things back. And this is how we do something called synthesis. So when we synthesize information, it's when we bring it into ourselves and we try to relate it to the other information we already have, right? And so by retelling something in your own words, you are synthesizing it, and also actually learning how to tell a story, by the way. You're synthesizing it, and you're relating it to the other information you already have. And so even my 6-year-old right now, one of my oldest son is 6, and he's already been doing narration for a couple of years, but also he grew up watching his older sisters do narration. So nobody even had to explain to him what it is. He just started doing it naturally. So when we read a gospel passage, or we read the life of a saint, or I'm just telling him about, events in the world and things like that, he will just narrate it back to me in his own words without being told to, because he's just synthesizing the information into kind of like his own. This is how this relates to all the other things that I know and that I've experienced and that I've learned. And this, I cannot stress how important this is and how difficult it is to do as an adult if you are not, if you haven't practiced. I went to a classical teacher's kind of like a week-long internship seminar kind of a thing. And it was in this method of education because it was right when we were about to start educating our oldest daughter. And but for the class time, what they were just doing was just reading from Charlotte Mason's books and then making us narrate the stuff we were reading back. And holy cow, was it exhausting to do as an adult if you don't have practice. Because what we're used to is just being given the information, right? I want to know something, so I Google it, right? As opposed to somebody saying, here's a lengthy and somewhat difficult passage. I want you to read it and then give it to me, like synthesize it into your own words on the fly and tell me what was important. Tell me what you noticed, right? But if you do this when they're young, before their minds have been just totally, eviscerated by the world that we live in. If you do this, if you do this when they're young, then what they actually are learning is the habit of attention, right? And what they're learning is, what you guys sometimes call like relevance, realization, all the stuff, the ability to read something or to hear a story or to be presented with facts or something like that, and actually to pick through what are the important things here, and then to synthesize it into their own narrative and to connect it to the things that they've already experienced. So this is the most, I say, one of the most fundamental parts of this kind of education. So that's what we do. And along the way, obviously, you do all the, you hit all the subjects. Subjects are boring. Every sentence has one, but anyway, you hit all the subjects, and there's a way to do math this way, and there's a way to do
narrative
really,
math. Whoa, we're not going there. No, steer away.
Anyway, there's a way to you can use this method to teach anything, and actually, once you know it, you can use this method to learn anything. And this is how I learned to tell stories, and this is actually how I still do them. Is I will read an ancient text. Most of my reading is pre-modern stuff, so I'll read an ancient text and then I'll try to write my own version of that story. And most of the world under starlight is that. It's
got all these stories now.
Yeah, most of the world under starlight is, I read let's say like a 5th century apocalyptic text. Well, for me to really be able to understand how an apocalyptic text works, the only way to actually understand that is to try to write my own. And that's how like most of the, pretty much all the lore, the mythology and whatnot of the world under starlight, that's basically how it came to be. So
fascinating, because like from the angle I see things now, what you're saying to me lands like, well, Vanderclay's basically doing narrative synthesis and teaching people how to do that, and that's why you see these little pop-up channels trying it.
yeah, I think so.
It's like, so this world I live in now is multiplanar, and like all the people, like when they're not doing things in the physical world, spend a lot of time, they like basically go into this meditative state in front of a black altar that flashes lights all over them. And this is akin to me a little bit to entering through the wardrobe. And so now their attention is in this invisible place that is the corner and so much else. And so we're coming together and doing this re-education things somehow. This now if you can slide over into game mastering a little bit.
Yeah. By the way, I did not intend to wear this shirt just for the show. This was literally just the T-shirt I put on this morning.
It's perfect follow-up to watching the Grail Country conversation, if you guys haven't seen it yet. So I'm working on the character classes because I want to gamify the participation in this part of the corner. And I don't know if you're at all familiar with anything I'm doing over here, but this is a beholder.
I've watched probably like 5 or 6 of your videos because I wanted to get a sense for like what your deal was before we did the interview, because I didn't know what to expect. And you've been really merciful to me in terms of like pop culture references this time, because sometimes you really like speak in them, and for reasons that you'll know if you watch Pastor Paul's video, I'm really bad at pop culture. So
you weren't subjected to a whole lot of Seth's influence, and you're protecting your children from it, which is what makes you worth talking to, probably. I mean, played out over time and years, right?
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
But that's the horde I'm trying to reach and recruit for the game is like the people who grew up under the influence of Seth, and like the people who have seen the Star Trek Next Gen show, the episode Darmok and Tanagra.
Yeah. No, actually, okay, so true story. When I was talking to Nate right before our recording, we were talking about your channel. And I said, man, watching this guy is like watching that one Star Trek episode where the guy only speaks in references to like, epic poetry and stuff. Like that's so it's Darmok and Tanagra. So anyway, and he was like, yeah, it is kind of like that. So yeah, you're on brand, man.
Yeah, it's because it's for like the way that people share stories, especially like obviously the liturgy. But that if they have the cultural reference, it allows for like such more concise and expedient conversation.
Yes.
But so I got these people, they keep showing up, and there's the world is a lot more predatory than people are indoctrinated to believe, because otherwise they're scared and can't get anything done most of the time. But and so like the things that have developed that starting to resemble classes for the project I have is like clip reapers.
Okay.
Like how your instructions, like it's like read a long piece and then pull out the key points and tell us in your own version.
Yeah.
Where it's like that, except they're watching really long videos, and instead of when they pull out the key points, they're doing it in clips.
Yeah.
And then they bring them like around the campfire. We do these fancy reapers harvests, so everybody can like you found something valuable, you bring it to the village, and that's we do it show and tell.
Yeah.
So that's one character class is Reapers. I'm trying to get there to be an accountability stalker class, because so many of us come on live streams and say things and then forget we ever said them, and so an accountability stalker is somebody who doesn't let a cast member, for better terms, forget what they said they'd do.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I think like there's the art of spinning the clips into a cohesive narrative that's looming at the moment. But I don't know. Would you? I don't know. Just from your experience being around us and the channels, and with the notion of trying to gamify things, do you have anything that pops out to you that might be of help at this point?
If you're trying to gamify things.
Like I don't know, would being somebody like you be a class?
Yeah.
I mean, are there skill checks? There's got to be skill checks for a guest on the show. I don't know. See, we got these things now coming out called ARGs, that are the reality altering or augmented reality games.
Okay, yeah.
Where you hold up your phone and you see stuff.
Right.
And I think the angle I'm trying to work from is a reality augmenting game.
Okay.
To where, like, sure, we're also this, and then we're playing this corner thing too. And I don't know. I don't know why. I think I'm just trying to confuse you, or I'm trying to better understand what's going on myself. And since you're a game master, you're a good person to poke with it.
I mean, I've always kind of thought of myself as a bard, I guess. Just in terms of the main thing I'm trying to do is tell a story. Even the universal history thing is like really storytelling. That's kind of like the whole premise, is that people think of history as a science, and it's not. But yeah, like as far as like I guess you could say, like, if you want to gamify the thing that I do, I'm a troubadour, right? I'm a wandering bard, right? I don't have my own place where I live. I don't have my own channel that I live on. But actually in let's say my embodied existence, I don't really travel at all. Pretty rarely. I don't go places. I don't, I do, because of all this stuff, I have been going to like some conferences and things like that. But typically,
speaking of which, yes. I heard you're booked for 24 Kansas City spring.
Yeah, that's right. So things like that, but are kind of the exception. But typically speaking, if we even vacation, we tend to like sort of staycation or whatever. Like I'm a very like rooted person. I like to stay in one place, and just be at my parish, be with my family, be with my people. But the but when I step through the portal, right, then I don't really have a home, right? I just sort of I wander from channel to channel, from station to station, then I show up and I tell my little stories for my supper, so anyway, I like a sort of like a perennial guest host, I guess you could say. So
how about we close with your narrative in this world? Like, okay. When did you get drawn into it? When did the Peugeot thing and up till now?
I think that it was kind of two things. One was that I was sharing a lot on the Symbolic World Facebook group initially, and on the Discord. I was sharing a lot about my readings of the Sibylline Oracles, which is a text I'm really interested in. And if you go all the way back to our first Universal History conversation, which was about a little over 2 years ago now, it was kind of around that. So I started, like, I was talking about that. And then at the same time, I did. I was asked to come on and start guest hosting the Ammon Sewell podcast on Ancient Faith, which is basically Tolkien or Orthodox Christianity, or like sort of
Oh,
Tolkien.
who's that? Who asked you, and how did you know them when they asked?
Yeah, so Father Andrew Stephen Damick was the hoster of that. He's the Ancient Faith guy, you could sort of say. Like, he does that, and he also does Lord of Spirits. But he started a Tolkien show, and I remember at the time I was like, well, dang it, I could do an Orthodox Tolkien podcast. But it was like, whatever, it's fine. He's doing it. I don't like starting things anyway. And then because I'd been interacting with the show, like I'd written into the show a few different times, eventually said, well, this guy's a Tolkien scholar, he's Orthodox, so they asked me on for an episode. And then that's kind of how we became friends. And then after that, he asked me to start coming on as a regular guest host. So I still do that once a month. But I came on as the regular guest host right at the same time that I was interacting with Jonathan about the stuff in the Sibylline Oracles. And then he was like, well, why don't, he's like, it's not fair, Father Andrew got you first or whatever. Like, why don't you just come on and let's do some stuff on universal history? So we had some private conversations first where we kind of talked about all these different stories and all this different stuff, history wise, and like the thing that we wanted to do, but also the secret thing that we wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And that's how I started doing that. And then the universal history thing just really took off. It's still like the most popular thing that I do. It's just really resonated with a lot of people, I think. And so we continue to do that. And that's basically how I got, roped into this little corner. There was like a big wave of people wanting to talk to me right when we started that. And then for a long time, I was just doing universal history. And then I think recently, because of Amboria, there's been like another big round of people who've wanted to have conversations, which I'm always happy to do. Like, I'll happy to come on and talk to anybody. So
what was it like when the consequences of going on Pat show started to come land on you? Like the people reaching out and stuff.
To be honest, it's sort of like a twofold thing. On the one hand, I don't really think about it. I don't usually. Most people at my parish don't even know I do this stuff because I don't talk about it to people in, like, let's say, real life. Except that they know, oh, he's the Tolkien guy or whatever. Like, they'll come talk to me about stuff, but I don't really think about it a lot. On the flip side, because I'm kind of a disorganized person, a lot of times when people reach out to me and they're like, I'd like to talk or something, I'll be like, yeah, that's great, let's do that. And then I just don't follow up. And it's not because I don't love them.
Well, if they ask you, they're supposed to follow up. It's on them.
Yeah, or think it's not because I don't want to do it, but part of it is because I've got a full-time job and also books I'm trying to write and things like this, and so a lot of it is just like I just forget, and so I just say all that to say, if somebody out there is like, oh, Richard said he was going to talk to me and then never did or something, reach out to me again. I'm really sorry. It's nothing personal. I'm just not a very organized person. So
was that ever weird though? Like when the request started coming in, was that an odd thing? Did it ever strike you as what's going on here?
For sure. Like, I'm kind of inured to it now, but yeah, for sure. Very, very strange, very weird. I've got this, this particular way of understanding history that I've just always kind of operated in this way. And so then when I found Orthodoxy, it was just like validating, but didn't really change the way that I was already looking at this stuff. And so, but to find that it resonates so much with so many people has been wonderful, yeah. Encouraging, surprising, yeah, and a little weird. And of course, we'll do the, I'll be out somewhere at some kind of a thing, like at church or some conference or something, and somebody will come up to me and they had that look, like, are you Richard Rohlin or something like that. That happens kind of often now, and at first it was weird, and now I just don't think about it. I think if you think about these things, then they can become like a little dangerous, but yeah, I just try not to think about it. Just try to do my things, and then just say yes to I've always been the kind of person who's like, yeah, say yes to whatever. Like, if an opportunity comes up, God's put something in front of you, got to say yes to it. My wife is a good counterbalance to that, because she's really more sensitive about like my time and how I spend it. And so sometimes she says no to things for me, which is also good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not always God putting stuff in front of you, bro. I don't know if
I know. But
okay.
Usually if it's just an opportunity to, I'm a really strong believer in hospitality as the most important form of evangelism, let's say. So like the best way to show Christ to somebody is to love them enough to take them seriously and spend time with them. And so I just, try to do that as often as I can, I guess.
Speaking of the Amboria wave of your popularity, I'm sorry I didn't hear about it in advance, because I do like the notion of not endorsing you until you play with us. And apparently Nate, well, I got your commit on Twitter for that, and I think your gravitas from being the Peugeot Ski-Doo kid, one day it's gonna happen. I think that's enough to pull Pastor Paul in. We haven't gotten the official agreement for that.
Cool. Yeah, I saw Nate's email. I'm down. We got to make sure it works with the schedule, because I got some books that I've got to finish up right now. But I'm always down to play, and I've actually been wanting to play that particular module, or like run it, for a long time. I may even have like 40 dwarves painted up because I just want to do like a big dwarven campaign. So I'm definitely down. I'm very excited. Yeah,
it's gonna be. Can you I don't know, lean on Pastor Paul in this video a little bit?
Yeah, Pastor Paul, come on, get with it. Let's go.
Commit, Paul. Commit. We need the commitment.
You gotta, like, one of the most fatal things you can do as a person is take yourself too seriously. And there's no better way to not take yourself seriously than making a fool of yourself on the internet. So come on, Pastor Paul, let's do this thing.
Jeez. And like, I always worried he wouldn't have time for it, but then he came out with that Andrea and that other guy thing for 3 hours, and I'm like, oh, if you can do that for 3 hours, we can do a game.
For sure. Yeah, let's get it on the schedule. I do have, like, one of the things that was part of the Amboria Kickstarter is there was a tier that the company wanted to do where you could play a game with me if you backed at the certain tier. And I was like, we'll probably get 3 people. Well, we got like 36. So I've decided what I'm going to do is run an anthology campaign where I'm going to divide the players up into 3 different factions and set the same goals in front of each of them, and then run each group in turn, with the factions each trying to work towards the same goals, and we'll see who wins. And so that is gonna take like a lot of my gaming time once it starts up. But as long as we can, find the spot on the schedule, I'm always excited to play.
What is your schedule for Amboria at the moment? Like, as far as, like, you're still writing it, but it's kickstarted.
Yeah, so like the writing is done in the sense that, the campaign is written, but the campaign is written in a way that I could run it, but I've got to make sure it's written in a way that you could run it. So that's the stuff that I'm kind of finishing up right now. I have about a week left, I think. But the core book is done. So pretty soon, basically as soon as we get like all the Kickstarter collects all the money and sends it to us, which usually takes about 2 weeks, then we will release the playtest drafts of the game. So just be like Word docs without editing and typesetting. And then over the course of the next few months, we'll be doing, Strange Owls, the publisher, they'll be doing editing and typesetting, and, probably will send things back to me for edits and stuff like that.
Make it pretty.
Right. And then once that's done, the PDFs of the game will come out this fall, and the files will go to the printer. Our printer is Studio 2, who's done a lot of printing for like a lot of really great games. These are going to be beautiful books with like, stitch binding, UV spot treatment and ribbons and like everything. Going to be really beautiful books. So, but all of the art and the all that layout and all that stuff will have to be done, and then we'll send it off to the printers. And then so the book will probably be printing and coming to like bookstores, and Studio 2 is a big distributor. So basically anywhere you can buy RPGs, you should be able to buy this game. And they'll be probably shipping in spring of next year. So if you backed it, PDF, or you want to buy it, PDFs in the fall, hardcovers in the spring.
Excellent. Let me ask you 2 questions. What is your favorite episode of the Amansul podcast, and what's your favorite? That'd be favorite, but I need from you 1 episode from both the Amansul and with the Universal History to recommend.
Oh man, Amansul is really hard because it's like, oh boy. So if people don't know, the Amansul format is that we have a regular host and a guest host. and it's a different guest host every time. But obviously, there are a lot of recurring ones. And so, like, picking a favorite episode is like picking between like my friends that I've invited onto the podcast. But hold on, let me just look at the role of the episodes, because some of these are really, my more my favorites than others. If not friends episodes. I really like the whole series that we did on the story of Baron and Luthien. So it's like 2 or 3 episodes. And Andrea from This Little Corner is on there on one of those. And anyway, I think that's...
What's the first one? It's a series. I'll put the first one as the click.
Yeah. So the first one is, well, I tell you what, the one that she's on, which is really great, is called Elf Girl Summer.
Elf Girl
77.
Summer.
Yeah. So if you want to hear me and Andrea talk, that's one of my favorite episodes. She's a really good guest.
Since we've mentioned her twice now, I'm going to give you the secret reveal. I've DM'd that girl.
Oh, nice.
And I don't mean private message.
Very good. Yeah. So yeah.
The Universal History one.
Universal History one. Which one of those is my favorite?
I caught the Ethiopia one. I like that one.
Yeah, the Ethiopia one is, I think, like, that's the one that's like everybody's kind of really popular one. I think this most recent one we did, the symbolism of nationalism, is one of our best ones. I'm looking at the list here. It's bad. I should remember everything that I've done, but the holy 2-part episode on the Holy Grail. That's my favorite. That's my favorite. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm deeply obsessed with the Grail story. And constantly thinking about it. As a little spoiler, another little spoiler for people is that when I finish up all this Amboria stuff, one of the next projects I'm going to undertake is actually to take a stab at retelling the Arthurian stuff. So people can keep an eye out for that. But so those are my favorite episodes. The 2 on the Grail. They're certainly the ones that are like the most personal for me. So,
all right. Well, I've taken way more of my time than I normally do, and yours is more valuable. So one thing I do around here is I play a little clip, and I say, "Is there any?" It says, "Is there anything you want to say in conclusion?" And then I make the guest full screen for them to say that, and then I take them away. Okay. So prepare yourself. Here it comes.
Do you have anything you want to say in conclusion?
Go tell stories, guys. I saw a post just the other day from kind of an Orthodox influencer talking about the importance of storytelling for Christians and things like this. But it's one thing to talk about why these things are important. We spend way too much time in this little corner talking about things and maybe not quite enough time doing them. So I would encourage people to go and tell stories. If you're looking for an easy way to get into it, I strongly recommend tabletop gaming. It's where you should start if you're trying to recover your imagination as an adult. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
Where you should start. I love it. One more time, Paul. Come on,
let's go.
All right, thanks, Richard. This has been great.
Thanks. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
And everybody, I hope you too had a wonderful time on this Narnia Narrative and Planes of Existence stream with Richard Rohlin. And make America honest again. Choose denim.